The slap cracked through the icy morning air before anyone understood what was happening. It was not loud because of force, but because of silence, because 50 soldiers froze at the sight of a decorated general striking the youngest, weakest soldier in the yard. Dust lifted with the impact, drifting like powdered disbelief. The soldier, barely 20, staggered back, not out of defiance, but because his body had never learned how to stand firm against humiliation. Private Hale was known as the fragile one, too slow, too quiet, too thin, too much heart and not enough muscle. At least that was the judgment whispered behind him. He had joined the Navy hoping pain could bury memories he never spoke about. But here, under the ruthless winter sun, even his memories felt warmer than the cruelty unfolding before him. General Rook towered over him, his uniform crisp, his stare sharp enough to cut through steel. He was a man carved from battles he survived and mistakes he never admitted. Rumors painted him as invincible. He believed them. His chest carried medals, but none heavier than the pride pressing against it. The general had seized on Hale the moment he noticed him struggling with the morning drills. Hale's hands trembled while loading a practice weapon, and that tiny tremor ignited something dark in Rook. "You're useless," Rook snarled, not shouted, simply delivered the words like a verdict he felt entitled to give. The insult rolled across the yard, staining the cold air. Soldiers looked away, afraid to catch Hale's eyes, afraid to be seen showing sympathy. But the omniscient truth hung above them like a storm ready to split open. No one there knew how close the general was to confronting a truth that would shatter his pride. And Hale, the trembling soldier, was a fuse Rook had just lit with his own arrogance. Hale didn't raise his head. He didn't defend himself. Quiet humiliation settled into him like cold rain soaking through cloth. Yet beneath that stillness was a strange depth, an old ache, old discipline, old pain he had trained himself to bury in layers, so deep even he sometimes forgot. Something flickered in him now, faint as a candle behind a shutter. Rook took one step closer, boot crushing gravel. The silence wrapped tighter. Everyone could feel it, a moral line breaking, a weight shifting, a consequence forming like fog before a lightning strike. One of the senior instructors, hardened but fair, watched from the side with tightening fists. He had seen Hale collapse under exhaustion before, but had also seen him rise again, refusing to quit. Weak, perhaps physically, but there was something about the boy's quiet endurance that stayed with him. Something Rook was too blinded by ego to notice. The general lifted his chin, the way a man does when he expects obedience without question. "Look at me when I speak to you," he said, voice chillingly calm. Hale slowly raised his eyes. For the first time, Rook noticed there was no hatred in them. No fear anymore, just an unsettling depth, like someone who had known pain far sharper than humiliation. Someone who had been forged somewhere far darker than any boot camp could ever simulate. Across the yard, the wind seemed to pause, as if waiting for the world to catch up. A shift so slight, so quiet, passed through Hale's posture that only a trained fighter would recognize it. A real fighter, a deadly fighter. Rook didn't see it, not yet. He only felt a strange, sudden cold run down his spine, without understanding why. Something was about to happen that would redefine every man watching, including him. The training yard held its breath as Hale stood motionless, the soft echo of the slap still lingering in the air, like a wound that refused to close. Rook believed he had finalized the moment, asserted dominance, restored order, showcased authority. But the moment had only just begun. The air around them thickened, heavy with an unspoken truth. The fragile soldier was not breaking. Something inside him was awakening. The general stepped back, not out of fear, though the instinct flickered through him like an unwelcome shadow, but because Hale's eyes unsettled him in a way no battlefield ever had. They were not defiant, nor pleading. They carried the quiet, haunted calm of someone who had endured deeper horrors than humiliation. Rook had seen that look once before in prisoners of war who returned with their spirits fractured yet sharpened in ways normal men could never understand. And yet this was Hale, the weakest soldier in the unit, the one whose hands trembled when holding standard gear, the one who moved like his bones remembered starvation, the one who apologized even when he had done nothing wrong. That Hale was now standing before him with a stillness that seemed to absorb the weight of the entire yard. A thin cloud drifted across the sun, and the light shifted just enough for Hale's shadow to stretch toward Rourke's boots. A symbolic detail unnoticed by most, but it struck Rourke like a whisper he couldn't quite interpret. The instructors along the sideline exchanged glances. Some sensed the imbalance shifting, others dismissed it as tension. But every instinct in their bodies warned them that the next heartbeat could change everything. Hale finally inhaled a deep, grounding breath that cracked through the quiet. It wasn't rebellion, it was realignment. His shoulders settled with the ease of a man who had been trained not by the Navy, but by survival itself. And survival had never been gentle with him. Rourke tried to override the unease coiling in his chest. "You think discipline is optional?" His voice remained low, but it wavered, the first fracture in his steel facade. "You think weakness is something I will tolerate here?" Weakness, the word struck Hale harder than the slap. Not because it insulted him, but because it reminded him of all the nights he had fought to breathe in a world that had tried to erase him long before he wore a uniform. Hale did not see himself as weak. He saw himself as someone who had learned to endure silently because silence had always been safer than speaking. He lowered his gaze briefly, not in submission, but in reflection. Then he looked back up, and something ancient flickered through him, like a buried instinct rising from the ashes of memory. His voice, when it finally emerged, carried a tone no one had heard from him before, soft, controlled. "And impossibly calm, sir," he said. "If you knew where I came from, you wouldn't call me that." Rourke froze. The words were not loud, but they landed with the weight of a confession wrapped in a warning. The kind only a man with a past dangerous enough to haunt him could speak. A murmur rippled through the watching soldiers. No one had ever heard Hale speak with such clarity, such certainty. The instructors stiffened. This was not insolence. This was truth rising through the cracks of a man who had spent too long hiding his fire under layers of fear. Rourke's jaw tightened. "And where is that?" he asked. Though part of him didn't want the answer, Hale didn't reply. He didn't need to. The silence he offered instead was more revealing than any confession. Rourke took a step forward to reclaim control, but the ground beneath his authority had already begun to crumble. Hale stood straighter, his spine aligning with a quiet power that felt trained, not by the Navy, not by any official force. Something else, something dangerous, and for the first time since striking the boy, Rourke felt a cold realization bloom in his chest. He might have just picked a fight with someone whose strength didn't need to be shown to be feared. A strange hush swept over the training grounds, the kind that descends not from peace but from quiet awareness that something irreversible has shifted. The soldiers around them sensed it, a subtle, electric tension threading itself through the cold air as Hale continued to stand, unbroken and eerily composed. It unsettled them more than the slap itself. Strength was familiar. Fury was familiar. But calm in the face of humiliation belonged to men who had survived storms far beyond military drills. General Rourke tried to steady himself. He had built his identity on mastery, of discipline, of men, of fear. Yet looking at Hale's silent poise now felt like staring into a depth he couldn't measure. Something about the boy's stillness made Rourke's instincts twitch, the way they only did before an ambush in hostile territory. It confused him, it irritated him, most of all it threatened him. He attempted to regain ground the only way prideful men know, by pressing further. "If you have something to prove," Rourke murmured, stepping close enough for Hale to feel his breath, "then prove it, or accept what you are. What you are." Those words drifted toward Hale like an echo from his past, not from the military, not from Rook, but from the shadows of a childhood lived in rooms where light rarely entered. Rooms where he had learned to survive by listening, calculating, adapting. Every bruise had taught him strategy. Every silent night had taught him patience. Every fall had taught him how to rise without drawing attention. Hale didn't flinch now. He simply lifted his chin a fraction, revealing not arrogance, but an unspoken resolve shaped by scars, no uniform displayed. Rook noticed that shift. His chest tightened. Around them, the instructors exchanged quiet, wary glances. Lieutenant Ward whispered almost inaudibly to Sergeant Miles, "He's not scared. Why isn't he scared?" Miles shook his head. "Because he knows something we don't." The wind circled them like a restless witness. Hale exhaled, slow and steady, grounding himself. He had never wanted confrontation. Survival had trained him to avoid it. But something inside him, some buried instinct recognized that running from this moment would condemn him to the same cycle he had been trying to escape his entire life. This was not about pride. It was about reclaiming something stolen from him long before today, his right to exist without apology. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet gravity that made even distant soldiers straighten unconsciously. "You think I'm weak," he said, "because you've only seen me struggle. But struggle is how I learned everything that's kept me alive." Rook stiffened. The words were too precise, too steady, too controlled for the timid recruit he had labeled as useless. Hale continued, "Strength isn't always visible, sir. Sometimes it's silent. Sometimes it hides until it has no choice but to surface." The general's throat tightened. Something in the tone, not the content, pulled at an old, unwelcome memory he hadn't revisited in years. A memory of a boy he once knew, who had endured far more than anyone saw. A boy Rook had buried under medals and power. He forced himself to stare Hale down. "Are you saying you're stronger than this unit, stronger than me?" The question was meant to provoke, to corner, to reassert control. But Hale didn't react, not with fear, not with anger. Instead, his gaze softened, as if he pitied the man trying so hard to maintain his throne. "No," he said, "I'm saying strength isn't what you think it is." The simple statement disarmed the yard more effectively than violence ever could. Rook took half a step back without realizing it. His boots scraped the gravel, and the sound cut through the air like an admission. The instructors noticed, the soldiers noticed, Hale noticed. Rook's authority, his untouchable, unquestionable authority, was cracking. And then, unexpectedly, a tremor of unease slid down the general's spine. Not fear of Hale harming him. Fear of Hale revealing him, revealing the parts of himself he had spent a lifetime burying beneath power and dominance. It was the first time in years he felt the instinctive flicker of vulnerability. Hale watched him silently, not triumphantly, but with a strange clarity, as though he understood exactly what war was taking place inside the general's chest. And in that moment, Rook realized something chilling. This wasn't about discipline anymore. This wasn't about weakness or strength. This was about truth, and Hale was forcing him to confront his own. Something inside Rook wavered. His breath hitched not visibly, but enough that he felt it. And the entire yard waited to see what would happen next. The yard seemed suspended between heartbeats, frozen in a fragile moment where pride, pain, and truth collided so violently that even the air felt afraid to move. Rook stood facing Hale, but for the first time he wasn't looking at a trembling recruit. He was looking at a mirror he had avoided his entire career. A mirror reflecting what he once was, and what he had sacrificed to become untouchable. Hale's stillness was no longer misread as weakness. It carried history, the kind forged in places where mercy did not exist. The soldiers sensed it instinctively. Something inside this young man had endured storms that would have shattered others, and now that depth stood revealed, not through aggression, but through an unsettling, almost sacred calm. Rourke tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. The certainty, the authority, the unshakable command gone. All that remained was a man who suddenly realized he had crossed a line he never should have touched. He remembered the slap as though someone else had delivered it, the sound, the shock, the cold expression he had worn. He had humiliated a soldier who had never once disrespected him, a soldier who carried his own shadows, a soldier who met cruelty with a strength Rourke had long forgotten. Hale stepped forward, not threateningly, but with the quiet grace of someone who had stopped running from pain. The movement made every soldier unconsciously straighten, as though witnessing the rise of something powerful and inevitable. He didn't raise his fists, he didn't shout. He simply stood before Rourke, close enough that the general could see the faint scar near his jaw, a scar old enough to carry a story he had never shared with anyone. Hale's voice emerged soft, but it landed with the weight of a lifetime. "You don't know what I've survived," he said. "You don't know what it took just to stand here today." Rourke blinked. The world around him blurred for a moment, and Hale's words slid into the cracks of memories he had sealed away. A childhood under a cruel father, years of fighting to prove he wasn't worthless, battlefields where fear was disguised as valor. He had spent a lifetime beating his insecurities into silence. And now Hale, quiet, fragile, persistent Hale, had spoken them aloud without even knowing. A pressure built in Rourke's chest, heavy and unfamiliar. He searched for anger to protect himself, but none came. Only a quiet, overwhelming shame. The soldiers waited for Hale to step back. But he didn't. He bowed his head not in submission, but in a gesture that felt almost like forgiveness. "You can call me weak if it helps you," he said gently, "but it won't change who I am, and it won't make you stronger." The words hit Rourke harder than any punch. They stripped him of his armor, his rank, his image. For the first time in years he felt human, and it terrified him. A long, trembling breath escaped him. His hands, usually steady, faltered. He felt the weight of every man watching, but for once he didn't care about being the unbreakable general. He cared only about the truth staring him in the face. Rourke dropped to one knee. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't forced. It was instinct and unconscious response to the realization that he had been wrong in the deepest way a man can be wrong. Gasps rippled through the yard. Soldiers who had grown up idolizing the general watched in stunned silence as the indestructible man knelt before the recruit he had called useless. Rourke bowed his head, Private Hale, his voice cracked. "Forgive me." The words trembled with raw humanity. An apology not shaped by protocol or pressure, but by a soul finally confronted with itself. Hale stared at him, not with triumph, but with compassion. The kind of compassion only someone who had been broken and rebuilt could offer. Rourke continued, voice barely steady. "You have more strength in you than I ever saw, more than I allowed myself to see, and more than I have left." Silence washed over the yard like a blessing. Every soldier felt it, a shift so profound it seemed to cleanse the air. Hale reached out not to punish, but to lift. His hand rested lightly on Rourke's arm, helping him rise, not as a superior, not as a subordinate. As men who understood suffering, Rourke stood shakily, eyes burning with something he refused to call tears. Hale offered a faint, fragile smile, the first sign of warmth the yard had ever seen from him. And in that moment the entire unit felt something rare and unforgettable. Strength was not in dominance. Strength was in humility. Strength was in standing back up, not after victory, but after admitting the truth. The slap that had begun as humiliation ended as transformation. The general regained his humanity, the soldier reclaimed his worth, and the yard witnessed a moment none would ever forget. The weakest soldier had brought a legend to his knees not through force, but through the quiet power of someone who refused to disappear.